importantly, we have our special guest speaker, Dr. Aysha Wazwaz, who will be discussing the abortion debate. So now to start us off with some words of the Quran, Sheikh Abdullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Is my voice clear? Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون والذين هم لأماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم على صلواتهم يحافظون أولئك هم الوارثون الذين يرثون الفردوس هم فيها خالدون ولقد خلقنا الإنسان من سلالة من طين ثم جعلناه نطفة في قرار مكين ثم خلقنا النطفة علقة فخلقنا العلقة مضغة فخلقنا المضغة عظاما فكسونا العظام لحما ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين ثم إنكم بعد ذلك لميتون ثم إنكم يوم القيامة تبعثون ولقد خلقنا فوقكم 7 طرائق وما كنا عن الخلق غافلين وأنزلنا من السماء ماء بقدر فأسكناه في الأرض وإنا على ذهاب به لقادرون فأنشأنا لكم
به جنات من نخيل وأعناب لكم فيها فواكه كثيرة ومنها تأكلون وشجرة تخرج من طور سيناء تنبت بالدهن وصبغ للآكلين وإن لكم في الأنعام لعبرة نسقيكم مما في بطونها ولكم فيها منافع كثيرة ومنها تأكلون وعلى الفلك تحملون صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Abdullah, for that beautiful, beautiful recitation. Now I'm just going to share my screen for some Mass New York updates, inshallah. So for some upcoming events, bi'idhnillah, we have our Mass New York members barbecue. It is on August 20th at Bear Mountain. To RSVP, we're going to send the link, inshallah, on this chat, and you can RSVP for yourself and your family. Inshallah, we hope to see you guys all there on Saturday, August 20th, bi'idhnillah. Next, we have our youth camp, and the early bird registration has begun. The youth camp is on September 2nd to the 5th. And so if you're from the ages between 15 to 28, we encourage you to register and attend this youth camp. If you are a parent and you have a child who fits within this age range, we highly encourage that you sign your child up for the youth camp. You can contact our youth director for more information if you want to learn more about this camp, inshallah. Next, we have a Dawah workshop presented by our Imam Wesley LeBron. It's located in Mas Ibn Sina on Saturday, August 20th. And the workshop is basically about how to approach dawah and how to give dawah to non-Muslims. We have a new program coming up in the Tarbiyah department. It's called the Khatib Training Program. It is open for brothers and sisters ages 18 and up. This is a very selective program because we're choosing about 15 individuals who will be concentrating on training them on how to give khataras and lectures. So inshallah, bi'idhnillah, this is like a 1-year intensive program that we hope by the end of that year, we will have 15 trained youth who can give khataras in youth gatherings, and for brothers to give khawatir during Jum'ah Salah, inshallah. Some revert events and classes coming up. There is the Reverts Reconnect Picnic that's coming up. Please contact your local Revert director to find out more information, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, with where they're going to meet up and the date and time, inshallah. Next, they also have a brothers hiking trip on August 7th. They're meeting up at the Bronx Muslim Center at 8:30 a.m. So if you are a brother and you're around that area, please do attend and encourage your other brothers to attend as well. There's also Quran classes for our reverts, and it's basically to help them memorize the smaller surahs, such as Surah Al-Fatiha and some of the shorter surahs in Juz Al-Amma. So this is a class that is happening on Saturdays from 7 to 8 p.m. You do not need to know Arabic in order to take this class. Yes. And lastly, there are new classes for our reverts located in our 3 centers, the Masjid Center on Saturdays at 6:30 p.m., Ibn Sina Center, which is in Queens, on Friday at 8:30 p.m., and the Bronx Muslim Center on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. And this is all that we have for today for our announcements. Stop sharing. So now, inshallah, we're going to get to our program with our special guest speaker. For today, we have Dr. Aysha, who was born in Minnesota in 1979. She's the founder of Gems of Light, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating women on Islamic education. She serves as a chaplain and a Muslim advisor at St. Catherine University. Dr. Aysha has her PhD in Islamic Studies with an honors from Jinan University. She wrote her dissertation on Islam in the Positive Orientalism, Karen Armstrong as a Paradigm. She has her master's in Contemporary Islamic Studies from Al-Quds University. Her master's dissertation is now a published book.
Sundus, we can't hear you anymore. Sundus, can you hear us?
Assalamu alaikum. Do you guys hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know where you guys lost me.
You were talking about the published book.
Yes, okay. So, Dr. Aysha has her master's in Contemporary Islamic Studies from Al-Quds University. Her master's dissertation is now a published book in Arabic, which is titled Surat al-Islam في إعلام المحافظين الجديد في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية, which translates to the image of Islam in the neoconservative media in the United States of America. Lastly, Dr. Aysha has her bachelor's in Islamic fiqh, also from Al-Quds University. She also has over 18 years of experience in teaching Islam in Al-Quds and nationwide. She's a lecturer since 2007 to 2011 at the Islamic University of Minnesota and Gems of Light and many other places. So now, without further ado, Dr. Aysha.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and jazakallah khairan for the introduction. Inshallah, you can all visit the Gems of Light website. Has, I would say, more detailed and probably a little bit different than what was presented, just a little slightly different things in the intro, but that's all right. I was asked to speak about abortion, and this topic is a really sensitive topic, and the most important reason why it's a sensitive topic is not necessarily because it relates to human life, but also because it is part of the different issues that are right now considered as, I would say, these corners within the Muslim identity within the US. And of course, there are many different reasons too why this topic is important, but that's one of the main reasons. So when we're looking at a lot of the different topics, whether we're talking about the abortion, LGBT, women's rights, feminism, etc., there are so many of these topics that are right now becoming the area of pressure, pressuring the Muslim community to embrace certain thoughts, because there's this feminist approach that if you embrace such an approach, that would actually prove that you are you are pro-women, that you are pro-choice, that you are pro-human rights, and therefore, of course, there's this area that lays out on what it means to be Western, what it means to be pro-women's rights, what it means to be liberal, what it means to give people certain freedoms. And the Muslims within the West, I would say, have in many ways, including, unfortunately, this is a sad reality that I must admit, including many Muslim women that have an academic and Islamic background, an Islamic studies background, because it's the pressure of the lobbying that's making many embrace different approaches and different thoughts without them realizing where it's actually coming from. Now, the topic of abortion is not a new topic within Islamic academia. When we're speaking about abortion, it was actually discussed before, and way before the West was discussing it within whether politics or within the society, way before. In fact, this topic was discussed within the books of fiqh since the early times of
Recording in progress.
Since the early times of Islamic law canonization. And of course, we're speaking about the mid-2nd century and the 3rd century Hijrah. In other words, it was really more than 1,200 years ago where the Muslims were actually discussing this topic. And there were a number of different terms that were used in the books of fiqh to mean the termination of pregnancy, such as al-isqat, al-ilqa, al-tarh, al-imlas. And of course, when we're speaking about these terms, we're just trying to lay out an idea of how widely the fiqh books were actually going in details in discussing issues that relates to human life or relates to the sanctity and justice, and speaking about morality and ethics and all these different details way before these topics were discussed now within the West. So what is really behind the abortion debate that we're facing right now? Number one is that we know that there are unexpected situations within the society, within a person's life. There's going to be a new addition to the family, etc., where there could be different situations that can probably bring in the necessity to rethink this child's life, or before their existence is actually starting. The other reason for the abortion debate is really feminism. The feminist rhetoric pressures bring in the fear into women from motherhood, and encouraging women into separating themselves from their bodies, and particularly motherhood and family. And like I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, even Muslim female figures with some form of Islamic background have also jumped onto this wagon without recognizing, or sometimes with recognizing. So they would embrace the feminist debate, they would embrace the feminist rhetoric without recognizing that they have actually created a different pressure, a different form of a sort of a, with all the oxymoron that it contains, sort of an Islamic type of a feminism, if you may, even though I regard that as some sort of an oxymoron to actually say Islamic feminism. But that's what is right now actually happening. Now, the other reason to this debate right now is the postmodern life pressures, and where relativism, it's all ethics are really just an issue of relative issue, and that you would have the personal approach, and that you would have the right to decide ethics, and no one else has the right to decide the different moralities of things, and justice is more of a relative issue. The other part is existentialism, in where it's all about you creating a purpose, and that essence does not precede existence, but in the other way around. You actually make your essence. You form your essence. You form and you create through lobbying and through different forms. You create justice, and you create your ethics. And the other piece of it, which is individualism, it's all that's centered around the individual's life, and they would regard the ethical things that surround their life. The other reason for this debate is the Republican Democratic debate, and a conservative secular pro-life pro-choice, and a Catholic debate, and etc. Now this is really important to mention because it's really sad to say that a lot of coalition and alliances that Muslim organizations have actually done in order to create some voice, an active voice for the Muslims. They had created different alliances with feminists, liberals, Democrat lobbies, etc. And unfortunately, most Muslims actually embraced other organizations' agendas and left their own Islamic agenda, which really reflects the ignorance and primitive level of activism within the Muslim community. And when we speak about, to get to the issue, Islamic ruling on abortion or Islamic rulings on abortion, it's really important to go back. Whenever you want to discuss an Islamic ruling, it's not an issue of who makes the Islamic ruling, and it's not an issue of what pressures and lobbying pressures create the ruling, because Islam is not based on lobbying, it's not based on political pressures, certainly. And that's why when we want to speak about such a topic, we actually have certain legal maxims in Islam that we base different topics, in other words, the definition of justice, the definition of ethics on it. Now here's one thing, is that in the legal maxims of Islam, there are 5 important legal maxims in Islam: the sanctity of deen, the sanctity of religion, the sanctity of human life, the sanctity of human mind and mental health, and the sanctity of human, that is the origin of human life and family, in which is of course in nasl, hifd al-nasl and hifd al-ird, and finally the sanctity of property. So when we're speaking about that, we're actually speaking of one of the main five sanctuaries in Islam, which is the sanctity of human life. And when we're speaking about sanctity of human life, all the different things that produce human life, whether we're talking about marriage or sexual relations, etc., are actually considered in a place of scrutiny in Islam, because it relates to the sanctity of family. And sanctity of family is actually part of all the different legal maxims in Islam, and therefore considered that any type of a transgression on these areas is actually a type of a crime, and therefore considered that there would be a punishment to this crime, whether in the akhirah or in the dunya. The sanctity of human life, now to go further, the sanctity of human life, and of course it's really important to mention that the default ruling is that human life holds the highest level of sanctity, and that abortion is impermissible, especially after 100 days of conception, due to the following evidences. Now it's really important to just keep this one in mind, that the default ruling is that abortion is actually impermissible. But I'm going to speak about this 120. You're going to hear the numbers 120 and 40 a number of different times, and I'm going to explain that. I'm going to explain it as much as I can and simplify the understanding of it, because I do see that it is very common that we would find a lot of, especially women, unfortunately, for a number of different reasons, that are actually right now, including Yaqeen Institute, who had actually written a number of different articles regarding this topic, unfortunately did not do a good job regarding this topic, and I think it's really part of the political pressure out there. Regardless, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so when we speak about human life, when we speak about any evidences or studying Sharia, we always begin with the Quran as a resource, and then we would go to the Hadith, and then to al-ijma', to the different evidences that prove unanimous agreement, if there is, regarding a certain topic, and then if there is an analogy or qiyas. Now the default ruling, we would first start with the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Mu'minun, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ ثم جعلناه نطفة في قرار مكين ثم خلقنا النطفة علقة فخلقنا العلقة مضغة فخلقنا المضغة عظاما فكسونا العظام لحما. Now, what you see in these ayat, it's basically going into the different stages of embryogenesis. But scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether, when we actually look at this ayah right there, so this is speaking about the flesh going into different stages, and the different stages in where, whether it's the sperm, and then it goes into making like a leash type of a shape, and then a mudgha, something like a chewed substance, and then later we're talking about this development from bones to getting the flesh. But then the part about ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر, this little thumma right there, it within these ayat, you could see that the letter fa, which actually means that it's taking into this development and then right after, so therefore there isn't this long chronology. We're talking about a different stage, but the thumma actually tells us that there is a time lapse. This time lapse comes right before أنشأناه خلقا آخر. خلقا آخر, there where he was created into a different creature. So what does that mean? Was this some form of a vegetable type of a human development? Is this just speaking about a flesh getting into this different stages? And then ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر, then now in the final stage, then he becomes into a different creature. Does that mean before that he wasn't? But then here's the other debate, is that, well, the ayah says وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانِ, so this is talking about a human being, and these different stages are basically telling us that these areas are still actually telling us that this is still a human being. Now you could see that's why the ayah actually says وَإِذْ أَنْتُمْ أَجِنَّةٌ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ, when you were embryos within your mother's womb. It didn't actually go into different stages. It right and straightforward said antum, you were. That is speaking to the humans themselves, that even when you were within these different stages, you and it was actually the same person as you. In other words, this carries within the different stages the same sanctity as you and your life as a full human being. Now, at the same time, I'm not going to go in all the details because of time. You could see that all Sharia legal maxims in Islam emphasize, like I said, on the D-N-A-I-M, the sanctity of deen, the sanctity of life, human life, nafs, aql, ird, and mal, right there, human life, the deen, the human life, the human mind, the sanctity of ird, and family, and of course the sanctity of property. Now this is really important to mention, because when you look at this ayah, وَإِذَا تَوَلَّى سَعَى فِي الْأَرْضِ لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ وَالنَّسْلَ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْفَسَادَ. And of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was emphasizing those that actually cause destruction in the world, and actually said لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا, they would actually cause destruction, وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ وَالنَّسْلَ, and they would destruct الحرث. الحرث is basically speaking about all the different produce, all the different vegetation that is needed in order to grow what life needs. Now the word in nasl was actually focusing on يهلك الحرث والنسل, was actually speaking about not the human production, was actually speaking about the production of animals. But if production of animals was regarded as sanctuary, and was regarded as an area that must be respected, so how is it with human life? In other words, to actually reduce or in any way harm human nasl, human reproduction, is actually deserving to be more called fasad, more called a destruction within this world. And within, of course, within ethics, we're actually looking at this is considered a crime. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ, and do not kill any soul that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid from killing, except in justice, in situations of justice. Now there are different hadith that relate to this topic. And the most important two hadith are really one, the hadith of Hudhayfa ibn Usaid, and the other hadith, which is hadith Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Now, you could see that hadith Abdullah ibn Mas'ud actually is narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim. In other words, it is actually considered an authentic hadith. Now, scholars yet had differences of opinions on the hadith of Hudhayfa. Well, why even discuss that this debate? Does it have any relation with what we're talking about? So let's actually look at these two hadiths and understand what is the difference. So the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith, that you would be created in each and every one of you would be created in their mother's womb for 40 days and 40 nights, and then they would be created in a form of a alaqa, in a form of a leash like, and then they would be created in a form of a mudgha, in a form of a chewed substance, and then the angel would be sent to him, and he would be ordered to write four things, whether his rizq, in other words, the different things that the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would grant him, his life length, and in other words, duration of his life, and his actions, whether he would be a person of hellfire or a person of Jannah. And then, look at the word thumma right there. And then the soul is blown in them. And then one of you might actually do the actions of the people of Jannah. Well, I'm not going to continue this hadith right there because that's not our place of evidence, but just to point this hadith out. Now, this hadith, although yes, I use the Bukhari reference, but this hadith is actually considered one of the most important hadiths. In fact, this is probably the orbit of the whole debate. Now, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar actually said that when he had said in that this hadith, that when we're looking at these 40 and 40 and 40, that at the end all the scholars had unanimously agreed, you could see right there, they unanimously agreed that the soul would be blown inside the soul in 40 days. But here's the thing. So you could see that all the scholars of hadith, let me just quote right there. ورد في الخبر أن الولد إذا بقي في بطن أمه 4 أشهر نفخ فيه الروح أو نفخ فيه الروح متفق عليه, or نفخ فيه الروح متفق عليه مجمع بين أهل الحديث. In other words, it was unanimously agreed between the scholars of hadith that this hadith is actually authentic. Now, it's really important to mention that when we're looking at the other narration that Hudhayfa ibn Usaid narrated, إن النطفة تقع في الرحم 40 ليلة ثم يتصور عليها الملك. قال زهير حسبته قال الذي يخلقها فيقول يا رب أذكر أم أنثى فيجعله الله ذكرا أو أنثى ثم يقول يا رب أسوي أو غير سوي. Now the difference between this hadith and this hadith in where it actually laid out a certain numbering. So then the scholars had actually debated whether this is talking about an actual development, in where 40 happens this and 40 happens that, and 40, in other words, 40 stages. But when we actually look at the different scans, we see through the scans that it's not 40 days that they would look like a leash, and then 40 days that they would look like a chewed substance, etc. We could see that more closely that this is not talking about an issue of 40 days. In other words, it's not the chronology in where every 40 days this development happens, but this is actually speaking about different stages and different developments that happen within the human, the embryogenesis, and not necessarily time lapses. So therefore, when we actually look at 40 and 40 and 40, we could recognize this hadith actually gives us more clarity in where it's actually speaking about, yes, what we would get to is that within a certain point there is the nafkh ruh, there is the blown in the soul. So here's the question: when we look at the blown of the soul, does that mean that that's when the sanctity actually happens? That's what we're going to get to in just a bit. But here's one thing, is that generally speaking, whether the sanctity, whether we're talking about 120 days or before that, scholars actually came across another important or two important hadith, which is when the Prophet ﷺ, when a woman or two women had actually went into a fight with one another. Looks like one woman definitely went beyond than just a simple verbal fight and actually killed the woman and killed this woman that was actually pregnant. And the Prophet ﷺ had actually ordered that this woman would pay the blood money for the mother and for the death of the mother and for the death of the embryo that was killed as well. And you could see that whether Umar ibn al-Khattab and or Muhammad ibn Maslama, who was also a witness on this, had actually mentioned that and even ruled by this rule, and didn't go into the details of how far along the pregnancy was, which is why Ibn Juzay, a Maliki scholar, he actually said, and I quote, وَإِذَا قَبَضَ الرَّحْمُ الْمَنِيِّ لَمْ يُجِزِ التعرض له وأشد من ذلك إذا تخلق وأشد من ذلك إذا نفخ فيه الروح فإنه قتل نفس إجماعا. You could see right here القوانين الفقهية, and I purposely went to the actual resources in order to quote. So what does he say? He says, and if the womb had actually collected the semen, then in that situation it is impermissible to harm that substance in any way, and it would be a bigger harm if the actual development in the embryogenesis had already started, and it would be a bigger harm if the soul was blown within that creation. In other words, it reached 120 days. Then in that situation, it would be unanimously agreed upon between scholars that it would be as killing a human being. In other words, a complete crime. You could see right there that this is actually an ijma'. This is unanimously agreed upon between scholars. And like I said, I purposely am quoting from the actual books of fiqh because it's really sad to see that many are actually quoting from different areas, Islam Q&A, etc., without actually going to the actual books of fiqh regarding these matters. Now, but even though, like I mentioned, those different hadiths within those areas, but the core of the debate is actually this hadith, which is hadith Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. But at the same time, when we speak about why is this hadith important? Well, the only way of knowing justice and ethics in Islam is really through revelation, wahi, not speculation, not desire, and certainly not lobbying. And which is why at the end is that we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَن يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. At the end is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it is not befit for a believing man or a believing woman when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter in his prophet that they would actually use their own option, their own choice, their own speculation as the ruling, but they would go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whoever goes against the ruling of the Lord Almighty and His Messenger, then certainly they have gone astray and a clear astray. Now, human mind, theory, speculation does not have all the data regarding these topics, and which is why it's really important to understand that when we want to study the Quran and the Sunnah, we go back to the scholars' commentary on the previous evidences in order to understand what did they actually derive in terms of rulings from those ayat and those hadith. So Al-Qarafi, a very important scholar who was, in fact, Al-Qarafi is one of probably the most important genius scholars throughout Muslim history. In his book Al-Dhakhiran, there's also Al-Furuq al-Qarafi, just amazing. He said, and I quote, وَإِذَا قَبَضَ الرَّحْمُ الْمَنِيِّ لَمْ يُجِزْ تَعَرُضُ لَهُ. So I quoted right there Al-Qarafi, and the same quote Ibn Juzay, also Maliki scholar, also had actually quoted that, and I wanted to emphasize the different references because when we speak about fiqh, like I said, we have to go back to the resources. في حاشية الدسوقي, also a Maliki reference, لا يجوز إخراج المني المتكون في الرحم ولو قبل 40 يوما وإذا نفخت فيه الروح حرم إجماعا. What did he say? He says it is impermissible to release, in other words, abort the semen that had already begun to develop within the womb even before the 40 days. And if, now this is the reason why he actually said, and if the soul was blown in it, then it is impermissible, as unanimously agreed upon between scholars. The reason why I quoted this one is really because it's the Maliki opinion right there. But here we go back to Nihayat al-Muhtaj, who's also Shafi'i, well, not Maliki, but Shafi'i al-Ramli, and he said, أما حالة نفخ الروح فما بعده إلى الوضع فلا شك في التحريم. I quote, he said, as for when the soul is blown in the embryo, and after that, until labor, it is no doubt that it is actually impermissible to abort. أما قبله فلا يقال إنه خلاف الأولى بل محتمل للتنزيه والتحريم. ويقوى التحريم فيما قرب من زمن النفخ لأنه حريم. And he mentions, as for before the 120 days, it wouldn't be considered as it is best not to, but it is actually closer to being haram, and it would be considered a bigger haram, that is closer, it would be more haram if it would be closer to the time period when the soul is blown in that embryo. لو كانت النطفة ولو نعم لو كانت النطفة من زنا فقد يتخيل الجواز. He said that we're speaking about before the 120 days. If this pregnancy was from an adultery or from a fornication or from rape, then we may imagine the permissibility of it. Yet, if it was left until the time period of when the soul was blown in it, then there is no doubt that it is impermissible. So this right there, you could see Ramli in Nihayat al-Muhtaj. Here I quoted exactly the quote in where we could see that it is not an issue of, yes, it was lenient between the scholars to actually consider it as permissible, but the stronger, or let me say the further the pregnancy, the more it is haram, and by the time it reaches 120 days, it is no doubt that it would be haram, as unanimously agreed upon between scholars. The implication of this hadith: number one, due to the sanctity of human life, any termination of human life is impermissible unless this is an urgent matter. Weighing the urgency of the matter is not based on personal preferences, but based on intricate details that are weighed through the legal maxims of Islam, maqasid al-sharia. And such matters are to be given a fatwa on a case by case and not a general fatwa. And note, when we're speaking of human life and generalization on such matters, will indeed carry misevaluation biases and many times psychological influences. Now, it's really important when we speak about the sanctity of human life, it starts from the creation and not necessarily the blowing of the soul. Now, why is that? Because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gave the sanctity of even vegetation. How is it with human life? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ما قطعتم من لينة أو تركتموها قائمة على أصولها فبإذن الله وليخزي الفاسقين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was here speaking about the sanctity of vegetation and what you had broken down, in other words, from the different palm trees. أو تركتموها قائمة على أصولها. So in other words, it was emphasizing what had happened, but really giving a note that even vegetation is not to be harmed even during war unless there was a severe necessity. So if this is the situation with vegetation, how is it with human life? Human life is, even if it's still not completely in other words completely created, even if the soul is not breathed into it, it still is actually within the areas of into being sanctuary and to be regarded as respected. The scholars of fiqh and hadith relating to the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, I would still like to mention, so when there was still this debate, when does human life actually start? But when we speak about when does human life actually start, this is not necessarily saying that yes, we can abort right away, and the first thing that many would think that, well, the IUD didn't work, or the contraceptive pill didn't work, so therefore let me just use abortion as a way of contraception. That's not whatsoever something that scholars regarded as a way of contraception whatsoever. But at the same time, they discussed the part about abortion and when it would be permissible in situations where there is a dire situation. So they discussed still, when does human life actually start? Is it from the time of conception? Why am I noting conception? Because when of course the OB would calculate how far along this pregnancy is, they would actually ask the woman about the last day of her cycle. But in Islam, when the hadiths were actually speaking about the embryogenesis, they weren't talking about the time of the last missed period. They were actually talking about the time of conception. So we're talking about almost 2 weeks apart right there. The second part, when does human life actually start? Is it at 40 days or 120 days? And which is why when you actually look at that, there are those scholars' opinions regarding that, and where it's really important to still mention that human sanctity starts from the actual conception and not from the time of soul blown. Human sanctity starts from the blown of soul within the actual flesh and body development. So that's when they would actually discuss the 40. Why do we have differences of opinions on when and where life starts? Are there different stations mentioned in the hadith speaking of human development, therefore it contains life from the beginning? Or is this speaking about a chronology of human development? And that's where that debate comes in. Are these hadith actually speaking about the stages, or is this actually speaking about just that human development, and that human life actually starts at 120 or within that time frame at least? Because we cannot necessarily say here's the 120, this is the day when the soul is actually blown, because like I said, the conception is when we would actually consider based on the hadith, and not necessarily the last missed period. Sharia came up with uplifting hardship in exceptional cases, which is decided by qualified scholars in fiqh after evaluating the circumstances through the lenses of Quran and Sunnah and Sharia legal maxims. So here's a question. What about before the 40 days? Well, there are differences of opinions between scholars regarding abortion before the 40 days. And even in one madhab, there may be differences of opinions. The first opinion, I want you to look at these, and I'm going to be quoting right here, so please pay attention to this one. So the first opinion regarded that it's permissible in dire situations. I want you to look at the word dire situations, because unfortunately different areas had regarded that 40 days, and then they took it more of a type of a contraceptive form, or a contraceptive mean, and didn't recognize that this is actually still, even the scholars that regarded that permissible had considered the part about dire situations. And that was actually mentioned by a number of scholars, Hanafis, many of the Hanafis, and the Lakhmi from the Maliki, and of course Abu Ishaq al-Marwazi from the Shafi'i. Now, it's really important to mention here that they regarded it as long as it has not yet started the stages of human development, and which is what they used at the khalluq. And for dire situations, which is the actual madhab, for the actual fatwa for the Hanafi madhab. And I want to quote right here Ibn al-Humam, and I want to quote right here because this is really important. يُبَاحُ مَا لَمْ يتخلق شيء منه ثم في غير موضع. All right, so he said it, and Ibn al-Humam is actually Hanafi. He said it would be permissible if and only when the soul was not blown in it, and in other words, did it actually start the different stages? And he said, قالوا ولا يكون ذلك إلا بعد 120 يوما, and they said that would not be until 120 days. وهذا يقتضي أنهم أرادوا بالتخليق نفخ الروح. So there we go. Here's the Hanafi again, considering that when we're speaking about 120 days, so they regarded whether 40 days before the 40 days or even a little later after the 40 days, as long as, of course, 120 days in dire situations. In dire situations is the only time when it would be permissible. Most Hanafis agreed on this fatwa. Some regarded it as makruh. So even within the Hanafi madhab, some of them regarded it as makruh, since the early stages of life have already started in the conception and only permitted it in dire situations. Ibn Wahban, and he said, فإباحة الإسقاط محمولة على حالة العذر. And this is really important. Hashit ibn Abdin. So the Hanafi madhab, they would actually say that it would be permissible, and he said mahmulatun ala halatil udhr, which actually means it would only be considered permissible when there is a dire situation. So even the Hanafi scholars that mentioned or that said that it was permissible, they said fi halatil udhr. And you could see right there, Hashiyat ibn Abdin is considered one of the most, if not probably the most important reference, along with Fath al-Qadir, the most important reference in al-Madhhab al-Hanafi. Hanbalis, at the same time, have also regarded that it's permissible for the woman to drink some medication to induce abortion. So something similar to what we would call Plan B during our times, and only in the early stages of pregnancy till 40 days. So not after. So this is what today would be known as Plan B. And Al-Mirdawi, who's actually considered one of the most important scholars that wrote the book in Al-Hanbali Madhab, especially that Al-Hanbali Madhab has differences of opinions within the Madhab itself. So Al-Mirdawi comes in to actually mention and actually evaluate the differences of opinions between the Hanabila themselves, and actually say what the actual madhab really is. And he says يجوز شرب دواء لإسقاط نطفة ذكره في الوجيز. And then he would continue right there, that Ibn Aqil had actually said يجوز إسقاطه قبل أن ينفخ فيه الروح. And he mentioned here in Insaf fi Ma'rifat al-Rajih min Khilaf, he said that it would be permissible, and of course in situations to take a medication or drink something, that it would be permissible before the soul is blown in it. Follow up. The other scholars that had mentioned that it was makruh, and we're talking about before the 40 days here, just like Ali ibn Musa from the Hanafi, and they said since it's the beginning of and part of the early stages of life, they considered it as makruh. In other words, they regard it as still carrying the sanctity of human development, and therefore it is makruh. Makruh actually means it is hated. Which is why Ramli, in fact, Ramli right there is from the Shafi'iyya. He actually said that it would be that he regarded that would be in cases of necessity, such as situations in zina and rape. When is that? That's actually before the 40 days, not after 120 days. It's really sad to actually see that when we're looking at Yaqeen, unfortunately, unfortunately I've seen a number of different lectures that said even after 120 days, because of zina or because of rape, that it's permissible. It's actually not true, and no scholar actually said that. There's actually ijma' on that. Unfortunately, this definitely needs to be revised. And Ramli said وأما قبله أي قبل نفخ الروح فلا يقال إنه خلاف الأول. I actually read this one in where it quoted it before, and the other opinion is that it is haram. In other words, before the 40 days or even after the 40 days. And this is the opinion of majority of the Malikis, the Shafi'i, and many Hanbalis, and they regard it as impermissible. Let's see what they had said. They said, so here Dusuqi في الشرح الكبير, he said هذا هو المعتمد وقيل يكره إخراجه قبل الأربعين. He said This is the main basis of the Maliki madhab. And he said, and it is mentioned that it is hated to actually, in other words, abort it before the 40 days. Ibn Rushd, who's considered one of the most important Maliki scholars, he said, كل ما طرحته من مضغة أو علقة مما يعلم أنه ولد ففيه الغرة. In fact, he considered, in Bidayat al-Mujtahid right there, he said every single type of an abortion that was aborted, whether in the stage of the early stages, in other words, even if it was in the shape of a mudgha meaning like a chewed substance, or even in a stage of a leash, in other words, early in the pregnancies, even in the 9th week, 7th week, 8th week, in the end, is that because it's sanctuary, because it has the life sanctity, then in that situation, they said that there would be the expiation of paying the offense of al-ghurra, which is approximately the blood money, approximately $12,000 in expiation, or here al-ghurra, it's more of a to pay for that offense. Now, it's really important to mention that Hanbalis and Maliki, and many Malikis even regarded that if anyone were to induce abortion, both ghurra and kafara are to be done. The difference between ghurra and kafara. So kafara would be to fast 2 months in a row, and the ghurra would be to pay the blood money for the child's life, which is to be paid for the father or the mother, depending on who actually caused the abortion. Now, the preponderant ruling and conditions for abortion. Now, the general ruling is that abortion is not permissible except for dire situations, and that it would be in the first 40 days to remove harm or bring benefit, and this is to be perceived and to be scrutinized based on the sanctity of maqasid al-sharia, the preservation of the deen, preservation of human life, preservation of human mind, preservation of family, and the preservation of property, which is evaluated through, like I said, the sharia rulings, and of course the legal maxims. The dire situations are to be evaluated as case by specialists in fiqh and qualified medical specialists. Abortion in this stage is not a method of contraceptive, therefore hardship in raising children or financial educational hardships are not regarded as necessity that permit abortion in this stage. After the stage of 40 days and before 120 days, abortion is only allowed in situations where there are sure and not speculated danger on the mother's life, as given by specialized physicians evaluations, along with specialists in fiqh, on a condition that such harm could not be corrected, treated, and avoided by specialists within that field. Abortion after 120 days is not permissible unless specialists agree that the pregnancy will inevitably cause the death of the mother if not terminated, and that they do not have the methods to treat her case but through terminating the pregnancy. What if the mother's life was in danger after 120 days? There are 3 different opinions regarding this question. Number 1, the first opinion is that mother's life precedes baby's life. Opinion number 2, both lives are equal and we should not base matters on speculation unless a number of qualified scholars assure that only by terminating the pregnancy the mother's life is saved, and if the pregnancy is not terminated, both lives are in danger. This is the second opinion. Third opinion, both lives are equal and we cannot choose one life over the other, and therefore whatever happens in the end is just qadarullah. This is the opinion of Ibn Uthaymeen. I find it strange, but I just needed to mention it. What about after 120 days? Remember what I quoted الرملي أما حالة نفخ الروح فما بعده إلى الوضع فلا شك في التحريم. After 120 days, there is no doubt, and this is the quote right there. After 120 days, there is no doubt that is actually impermissible. And just like we quoted Ibn Juzay al-Maliki in al-Qawanin al-Fiqhiyya, he said that it was unanimously agreed upon between scholars after 20 days. So does rape or incest permit abortion? All scholars agreed that abortion is impermissible after 120 days of pregnancy, regardless of the reason of pregnancy. In other words, whether the reason was rape or abortion, rape or incest, it would not actually mean that it is permissible to actually induce an abortion. Al-Qarafi, I quoted what he had mentioned, that وأشد من ذلك إذا نفخ فيه الروح فإنه قتل نفس إجماعا. If it was blown, the soul was blown, it is actually considered as killing a soul. What about the psychological impact on the mother, etc.? At the end, we will work with the mother to treat her psychologically, to give her the therapy that she needs. But killing someone in order to save somebody's psychological state is not permitted whatsoever. So we would have to work on treating the mother psychologically and not necessarily by killing a baby. And which is why we actually quoted from Hashiyat al-Dusuqi, and we mentioned right here, وَإِذَا نُفِخَتْ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ حَرُمَ إِجْمَاعًا. If the soul is blown in it, it would be it is unanimously agreed upon between scholars that it is impermissible regardless of the reason. And here Ramli again, he actually mentioned it here, فَلَوْ تُرِكَتْ حَتَّى نُفِخَ فِيهَا فَلَا شَكَّ فِي التَّحْرِيمِ. Again quote, and he said, if the pregnancy, if it continues until the soul is blown in it, then there is no doubt that is impermissible. What about the rape stories that we hear in the media, and how these women needed abortion? That was the only way to save their life. Now, rape narratives used to support lobbying for abortion do not change the fatwa. Fatwa in Islam is not based on lobbying, and lobby pressures in a person's sex, male sheikh, female sheikh, that does not affect the fatwa. At the end, the fatwa goes back to the text, and to understanding the situation based on the nadhra, based on looking through the lens of legal maxims in Islam. Now, which is why the committee of Sharia, right there, committee of Sharia, I'm just going to quote really quick, right there they actually mentioned that if the pregnancy was within the 40 days and there was a legitimate need based on Islamic legal maxims to end expected harm, it would be permissible to induce abortion within this time period, that is 40 or less. Yet, if the hardship was in raising children or not wishing to conceive more than it would be impermissible in that situation. Important notes when discussing fiqh rulings. Fiqh is a complex science which requires detailed knowledge in both the circumstances that surround the situation and deep knowledge in the text and Sharia legal maxims. Medical studies gave scholars in fiqh more data that helped them understand the circumstances that surround the situation regarding abortion, both chances of survival for both mother and child. Yet, medical studies only answer some questions that give more details on the circumstances, leaving the discussion of morality, the morality of abortion, and regard this topic to text alone, which is wahi. Political pressures, lobbying, and someone's sex, meaning if it's a male sheikh or female sheikh or whatever, that does not change the way a fatwa is derived. Therefore, the feminist narrative that fatwas on abortion should only come from a female scholar is not a Muslim approach. And Jazakumullah khairan wa barakallahu fikum, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Aysha. I mean, that was mashallah. I love the presentation. Thank you so much for this PowerPoint, for all of the details, coming in with the facts, and really breaking it down for us. So inshallah, we will open it up for any questions. If anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand, mute yourself, or you can send it on the chat, inshallah. If you have a private question, you can send it to me or to our speaker, inshallah, privately. I think you gave so much details, Dr. Aisha, that no one can even like dispute what you said and what you presented.
I hope I didn't scare them.
Someone is asking, can you share the presentation?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Yes, I can. I will inshallah send it.
Inshallah. We can also open it up for any comments if anyone has any comments, feedback, and they would like to unmute and speak, or write it on the chat, inshallah. If not, then we can end, inshallah.
Inshallah. So I would like to just add, for those, I do have a lot of different lectures, especially tafsir. If anybody would like to join, we do have a group that you can join, and inshallah it would be helpful. And I'm going to be putting the link in the chat, so you could actually join our group and join us in the different lectures and tafsir and different topics as well. And Allah barik fikum. I'm happy that this was clear and straightforward, and jazakumullah khairan. Oh, so here's a question. How to reply to someone that says, I don't do it, just vote for others to have it, with the intention for those that really need it, isn't actions. So this is a very important question. You know, when we actually look at the situation that right now, when we're looking at the pro-choice and the pro-life, etc., all right, it's really important to mention that we cannot necessarily join a pro-choice block simply because they happen to give us certain advantages as a minority. And it's really important to remember that the default ruling in Islam is that abortion is haram. I know that right now, when we're talking about pro-choice, we're actually advancing a certain lobby, which is a lobby that is against the gun. Well, she's actually pro-gun control, and against all the different things that usually are to create a safer community, and most of the times with healthcare, so it's really intertwined. It's not an easy thing to answer, but at the same time we cannot vote to be pro-abortion, because most of the cases that are actually aborting are not necessarily because of rape or because of incest, even if we are to assume that they're going to do it before 120 days. They're definitely not asking us as a Muslim community, what do you think and what is the ruling, but to actually vote to terminate life, whether that was Muslim or not Muslim, at the end is actually voting for crime, and it would actually be haram. How do we understand the whole debate, the political debate of the situation right now? Should we advance the Democratic Party and etc.? I think we cannot necessarily just look at the abortion topic right here, but I think it's really important that the Muslims would create their own narrative, would create their own agenda, their own lobbying, their own group, in order to advance their ideas, to advance their rights, etc., rather than joining a bloc that totally contradicts Islam in many ways. So to actually join in a feminist lobby and think that, hey, it's basically giving women their rights is very, I would say, very primitive in activism, and we have to expand our knowledge about activism and how we do it before we jump and embrace different lobbies and different agendas and then lose our own identity. As Muslims, we have to be hanging on to our identity and to our identities in general before we would think of advancing certain rights, because at the end, our tawheed, our Islam, our Sharia is beyond all different worldly advancements. Holding on to our identity as Muslims is actually preceding every single advancement within this life. So we have to have this awareness first within the Muslim community. We have to create our own lobby to create the pressure, and there's no way that we can create a lobby unless we have awareness within the Muslim community that we cannot jump onto these wagons and then embrace it and forget our own identity. So this is actually the to answer the question, I think it's very wrong to jump onto the wagon of the feminists and liberals. In fact, most of the times they're actually attacking Islam and the ethics of Islam, to actually jump into it to get certain advancements that we think that are pro-Islam is actually very narrow in the perspective. Is a woman taking specific herbs that cause abortion, is it a sin if she didn't go to a clinic to abort? So there are differences of opinions between scholars on that. If we're talking about to cause abortion before the 40 days of pregnancy, we just mentioned all the details right there. So if we're talking about Plan B, which is before the 40 days, it's in the very early times. Okay, so in that situation, it would not be haram according to majority of the scholars, like we had seen before. But if we're talking about causing abortion after 40 days, then certainly this is the same thing. Whether she's taking a medication or whether a surgery is done, it's at the end of the day, it's called an abortion. And we just talked about all the different evidences to speak about it. If a sister already aborted for a medical reason because she didn't hear nobody telling her the opposite, what should she do to repent? So if she already aborted for a medical reason, there is no sin. If we're talking about a medical reason here. So
she said not for a medical reason.
Not for a medical reason. So if she already aborted not for a medical reason, then she would have to pay the kafara and the diya, which is ghurrat al-janeen, almost $12,000, to the baby's father, and fast 2 months in a row. Fast 2 months in a row, and she cannot miss out a day. So that would be the kafara. Question 4. What advice do you have to an Islamic organization and platform that give the mic and voice speakers that speak anti-Islamic rhetoric and pro-abortion ideas? It's really sad. It's extremely sad to see that a lot of the Islamic organizations are right now going into becoming a business than actually an Islamic organization. So they would invite different speakers just because they have their audiences, and they would think that, hey, this is going to bring us an audience. And even if it was on the expense of Islamic Sharia, or even if it's at the expense of the main agenda that this Islamic organization was wanting to advance, which is the Islamic agenda. So in that situation, that Islamic organization has definitely committed a sin by actually inviting such speakers, and they must point it out. And they had definitely created and were part of the misleading and part of causing a delusion to especially the young youth that don't actually know the truth, to a lot of these rhetorics and a lot of these words that were passed on. So to give the microphone and to give the platform to those that speak against Islam is actually haram, and they will be held accountable for it. What advice do you, the question says, what advice you have to us as audience? Oops, it went up. Okay, where is it? Okay, because we hear no and yes abortion talks, and we're just laymen, and it's just confusing. And many pro-abortion are famous in the media compared to the scholars that have the other opinion. I think it's really important to learn the deen. This is really important, that when you actually learn the deen, it helps you distinguish between the real scholars and between the scholars, the pseudo scholars, and it's really sad to see different areas, whether we're talking about Islamic organizations, masajid, or even acclaimed academic areas, really inviting people that are not specialized. And right now I'm seeing a lot of different women rise to actually speak, and they're actually invited, not necessarily because they are specialized, but because they wanted to give the impression that they are pro women. I think it's really important that we consider qualification and not necessarily just an issue of giving a quota. A qualification, regardless of whether that is a male or a female, is supposed to be the center. And it's not an issue of who gives the fatwa, but it's if that person is qualified to give that fatwa. And this is really important to mention. Question: How to destroy the slogan of "My body, my right" in one sentence? Wallahi, in one sentence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that controls your body, so you don't have the right over your body. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that controls the body. He is the one that created the body, therefore you don't have the right over your body, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the right over your body. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's right only. And in the end, inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We are for Allah and our return is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I guess to create that, how to destroy that slogan, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. There's that slogan right there that we could use. We are for Allah and our return is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another question: why Islamic ruling from the early generation have fiqh about abortion when it's a current matter? Are those scholars future tellers? No. Future tellers, you mean fortune tellers, or such practiced by ignorant people at their time? No, these topics, in fact, alhamdulillah, when you look at fiqh is very, very vast. And scholars of fiqh, when you read their books, geniuses. Believe it or not, historically speaking, fiqh was actually the specialty that not anyone could get into. So you had to have the highest GPA to study fiqh. All right, today, in order to study medicine, that's when you needed to have the highest GPA. But during Islamic times, it was the fuqaha that needed the highest GPA. Why? Because it regarded people's deen and people's lives, and therefore that actually went beyond any other specialty and any other need to make sure that we have very smart, intelligent scholars that are discussing people's deen and people's lives. Question: on the hadith al-Ghamidiyya, can it be used to prove that the zina have the right to live? Of course it is. The hadith al-Ghamidiyya, of course, it proves that the sanctity of the child, the life to live. Question: how to reply to those that say fiqh change according to time and place and uses a Shafi'i example of something? Actually, تغير الأحكام لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. This is not Shafi'i. This is actually quoted by Al-Hanafi. This is a quote by, there's actually Ibn al-Hajj, not Hatim al-Hajj, but Ibn al-Hajj was actually a Maliki scholar. He quoted it in his book Al-Mudkhal. لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان is actually a قاعدة فقهية. This is actually a قاعدة فقهية. This is not something modern. لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. And Ibn al-Zarqa, Mustafa al-Zarqa, sorry, actually went in detail to discuss the evidence on that. But here's one thing: is that لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان, that we do not deny that the rulings change because of time. This is not in changing what is معلوم من الدين بالضرورة. This does not include changing what is actually known in the text, meaning that it is part of الثوابت. There are certain things that are actually regarded as the default ruling. You don't change those, but we're speaking about changing when the circumstances change. The circumstances change, and when we're speaking about things that are not necessarily from الثوابت, not from the matters that are considered as نص قطعي الدلالة and قطعي الثبوت, not for matters that are قطعي الدلالة or قطعي الثبوت, things that are proven to be authentic, and the interpretation. There's only one interpretation. There's no change whatsoever. You cannot change because we're changing. We're right now living in the U.S. or living in wherever, and let's change it because hey, people are changing, so let's change it. No, in the end, we go back and nas if it is authentic, if it is قطعي الثبوت, قطعي الدلالة, we cannot actually change it by any circumstance, because in the end is that لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. This is speaking about when there is room for ijtihad, when there is room for ijtihad, room for deriving a nas based on changing the circumstances, and لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. There is no ijtihad when there is a text that gives a final quote on it. If there is a text, انتهى. There is no ijtihad. There is no change to the rulings of Allah. There are no changes to the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And barakallahu fikum and jazakumullah khairan for listening. Oh, there's another one. So here's a question. My doctor told me for DNC, and I was 8 weeks, 5 days pregnant. It's my third miscarriage because growth stops. But it was heartbeat early. So it's medical reason, right? My husband always have questions. Do we reward in akhirah? What prophets told us? So we would have to, before we actually speak whether this is permissible or not, we would have to look at the doctor's reports. We would have to look at the previous reports, and I cannot answer a question like that without actually looking into the situation and actually asking other medical doctors regarding this matter, whether there is any room for healing to be available, or cure, or what are the circumstances. So we can't answer a question like that on just a chat based on a fast note like that. We have to, like I said, it's only permissible in a case by case, anywhere we need a doctor's report, and then we need more than one doctor's report, and we need to further evaluate and further study the situation before we would actually give a fatwa regarding these topics. I think because in general Muslims lack their own lobby and might not be actively on the unity that will bring that about on a large scale from someone. What happens when political support is given for other reasons to agenda that clearly also have an Islamic angle, LGBT, for example, abortion, etc. So in the end, if I understood your words correctly, in the end, what we are seeing right now is a lot of the Muslims are really embracing the rhetoric, whether it's the LGBT or the abortion, and unfortunately those voices are, believe it or not, are right now becoming the voices that a lot of the imams, or even a lot of those that are Muslim activists, are right now embracing. And it's really sad to actually see that some are actually afraid or may not even be qualified and are right now going to this wagon. And unfortunately it's actually creating a huge misinformation within the Muslim community, and right now we're starting to actually need I would say another type of lobbying, another type of activism in order to educate the Muslims regarding these topics, regarding the abortion, regarding feminism, regarding postmodernism, regarding LGBT. We are right now needing Muslim forces, and what I mean by forces, I don't mean military, but I mean awareness forces, in order to bring about the room, the spaces, to give the Muslim students at schools the freedom to voice their words, to be strong, and to be able to stand up and say, we are against this. We have the right to voice it. We do not accept this. This is not how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, and to actually create a certain activism that gives the Muslims the space to educate the Muslims and even educate the non-Muslims about what Islam says. Unfortunately, we're seeing Muslims feel that, hey, we have to gather and we have to join because these are the people that are speaking against Islamophobia. So it became this fitna that we're right now falling into. And it's really important to right now, I would say, correct and correct our homes before we actually jump in correcting other people's homes. We have a problem within the Muslim community right now, in where we are losing a lot of Muslims in this whole, I would say, whirlpool of fitan that surround us. And we have to right now work on cleaning our own home, because at the end, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ وَالرُّجْزَ فَهْجُرْ. The first thing when you want to do da'wah, رَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, your Lord Almighty is your highest priority, and ثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, maintain that purity within yourself, within your clothes, within your وَالرُّجْزَ فَهْجُرْ, within your behavior. We have to correct ourselves before we actually go and turn and start doing our activism and actually lose our identity. So I hope, oh wow, and we're, see, I thought that was the end of it, and I was, okay, so here's the other question. What about after that? It would include nifas, or, so nifas, okay. If it is 9 weeks and above, and some said 12 weeks and above, if the pregnancy is 9 or 12 weeks and above, so 9 or 12, if the embryo looks like a baby, meaning it has hands, has fingers, etc., then that bleeding would be nifas. If it is before that, then you're seeing a leash, or you're seeing like a chewed substance, then in that situation it would actually be istihada. Can we say it's okay to follow the rhetoric of kuffar just to keep Islamic practice and scratch my back? Oh, la ilaha illallah. Okay. Can we follow the rhetoric al-kuffar just to keep Islamic practice? At the end is that, you know, when you actually look at a rhetoric, now pay attention to this one, a rhetoric doesn't come out of the blue. A rhetoric actually comes from a certain philosophy. So when you look at my body, this actually comes from a feminist, and then the feminist actually derived it from an atheist born and an atheist born idea. So we cannot necessarily use a rhetoric and not recognize that a lot of this rhetoric is actually based on a philosophy. And most of the rhetorics that we are seeing right now are actually based on an atheist and a new atheist philosophy. So be careful. So we can't embrace things without us knowing where it actually originates from, and become, without us recognizing, carrying not just the rhetoric but even the vision, without us realizing the vision of atheism or whatever have you. Can we say that one of the reasons of Muslim confusion identity is due to the mixing of Islamic teaching or kufr ideologies? There are a number of different reasons to why this Muslim confusion. I do actually have a YouTube video. It's called Crisis in Youth or something like that. Search my name and look into it, and it has all the details. And alhamdulillah, we're finished. Wa jazakumullah khairan and barakallahu feekum.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Aysha. Thank you so much. So inshallah, if you guys want to follow her, she does have a YouTube channel. She also sent her link on the chat if you want to be part of like the tafsir circles that she hosts as well. Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Inshallah, we see you for our next mass members meeting. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.